In this presentation, we'll consider marriage and the different perspectives from which marriage has been considered in anthropology. So there are two forms of marriage that anthropologists recognize, and the first is monogamy, which is marriage to one spouse, and polygamy, which is marriage to more than one spouse. And in terms of polygamy, there are two forms. There is polygyny, which is a form of marriage where one husband has multiple wives. This is, I think, what most people think of when they hear the word polygamy. And this form of marriage is very productive. You can create a lot of offspring through this form of marriage. It's commonly seen in places where you have a need for a lot of labor. Perhaps you need a lot of people to help work on a farm or vending in markets and so on. And typically, to be allowed within the community to have multiple wives, you have to be in good standing. Because while having so many offspring can produce a lot of labor, it also is a lot of responsibility. You have many mouths to feed, and so typically communities have some way of sanctioning who seems capable of maintaining such large groups and who does not. The other form of polygamy is polyandry, and this is a form of marriage where one wife is collectively married to multiple husbands, and this form is much rarer than the other form, polygyny. So in polyandry, you typically see marriage through a widow. She then marries one or more of her deceased husband's brothers. And we typically see polyandry in agricultural societies in which there's very limited resources. For example, much of Central Asia is mountainous, and in some areas of very mountainous regions, all resources are scarce. And we might see more polyandry, or we do see polyandry occurring in these situations, and it makes sense because it can ensure that property stays within the family. Because the other way that polyandry typically works is a wife marries brothers. So then all the property stays within the family and is not divided up. So again, you see that economic relationship and resource management being an important aspect of this form of marriage. And again, polyandry is very rare and even less practiced today. But it has a logic behind it if we think it through in particular situations. As I have mentioned before, I'll stay on the slide. As I had mentioned before, it's important to keep in mind that the marriage systems described by anthropologists don't necessarily tell us who is sleeping with whom. We might make that association in the dominant Western style of marriage, but we can see clearly in many different anthropological cases, for example, the Juwasi described in the chapter of our book for this week, that who is married to whom doesn't necessarily also mean that they are sleeping with that particular person or only with that particular person. Anyway, I'll be returning to this idea a little bit at the end of the presentation as well. Another main point is to recognize that all around the world, marriage is seen primarily as an economic relationship. Not many international students will be surprised by this because it is such a common way of thinking about marriage all over the globe. But for American-born and raised people, this might seem surprising. The Western ideal of romantic love can actually be understood as culturally specific, very culturally specific concept, which actually was described in the last chapter we read in our textbook. It might have been, maybe 2 chapters back. In any case, Robbins discusses this culturally constructed idea of love. And in some cultures, romantic love is associated with marriage, and in other cultures it is not. And so all over the world we see a contrast between what is discussed as a love marriage and what is discussed as an arranged marriage. Arranged marriage refers to marriages in which families are involved in selecting a suitable partner. And the degree of involvement varies. And I just want to make sure that everybody notes that an arranged marriage is not the same thing as a forced marriage, though when it gets discussed, commonly people use the term arranged marriage when they're talking about forced marriages. But not everybody who participates in an arranged marriage feels it's forced. Or when you learn a little bit more about what an arranged marriage can actually be, you learn that it's not necessarily a forced marriage. In many parts of the world, many cultural groups, many communities, people feel that their family members have a lot of wisdom in terms of picking something so important as a marriage partner and want their participation in order to make a better choice. And one factor in an arranged marriage that's considered in order to determine whether a partner is suitable or not is often economic suitability. So we see that arising again as an important aspect of marriage in much of the world. In both love marriages and arranged marriages, there's an effect on someone's social status to be considered. So that's part of the social impact of marriage. And we have terms for this where we describe different effects on social status. So one is hypergamy, which is marriage to a higher status spouse, and the other is hypogamy, which is marriage to a spouse from a lower social status. And it can be very obvious to think about what this might mean in certain situations. So, for example, caste system. It might seem really obvious how this would work. A marriage to someone of a higher caste might move that person's status to that higher caste, or vice versa. But in westernized cultures, or even specifically mainstream United States cultures, we can think about how we have clearly a social class system as well. And a person's status, though we might not discuss it so directly, might change depending on who you marry. And that might not be the ideal, but because the ideal is often assumed or considered to be marriage for love. But this does play a role and can be something that underlies different relationships, and we see it playing out in our stories that we tell as well. So I put this image here from the movie Pretty Woman on the slide because this is a story all about someone moving from one social class to another social class in a relationship, a romantic relationship. And I believe Maid in Manhattan, though I've never seen that movie, is another similar story. We have these stories all over our popular culture. And then another related group of terms here is exogamy and endogamy. So with exogamy, as we're referring to marriage outside one social group. And of course, the story of West Side Story, the musical, is all about that. And then endogamy is marriage within one social group. In mainstream American culture, you might think that, we don't really we don't have a lot of restrictions on whose social group you participate in, especially considering marriage and so on. However, if you look at it sociologically, at the numbers, most people do tend to date and marry members of their own ethnic, religious, and social class backgrounds. And so there is something going on related to that as well, even if it's less spoken about. For example, there were some very concrete terms related to endogamy and exogamy laid out in the chapter we read for this week with, I believe, the Trobriand Islanders and who they felt like they could marry and who they could not. In any case, we'll be discussing this a little bit more in terms of our own personal experience in one of our discussions this week. So these terms help us think, all these kinship terms help us think about both culture and society as related to kinship and specifically to marriage. And when we talk about changes in status, we're talking about our beliefs about social status, which obviously have an important impact on our lives. And we're also talking about our connection to resources, including our networks with other people. So in terms of distribution of resources, we have some important terms related to kinship as well. A flow of resources occurs when there is a marriage, and these terms help you to see the different kinds of variety that exists in the world. So most of us are probably familiar with the idea of a dowry, which is wealth that flows with the bride to her new household. And the idea here is that the bride is someone who will be taking resources from the household. Perhaps you could think of it as being a new mouth to feed. And so therefore some wealth should come with her into that new household. And obviously this has, in many cultures, been highly contested because of the way that women can be treated and families can be treated if there is not the appropriate amount of dowry paid and so on. But there is another idea as well that we see in some cultures in which you have bride wealth or bride service. And in this form of flow of resources, you have compensation to the groom's family being paid to the bride's family. And the idea here is that you're taking the bride's productivity away from the family of the groom, or her family of origin, and moving that productivity to the groom's family. So therefore, the groom's family needs to compensate them by either working for the family or providing some sort of wealth to the family. So we hear a lot about dowry. We hear far less about bride's wealth and bride service, but that's another way that this kind of distribution of resources can occur as well. When we think about the movement of resources, there's also a movement of people with marriage as well. And so we have some terms to talk about that. Matrilocality refers to marriage residences near the bride's family. So when there's a marriage, a bride moves, or the groom moves to live near where the bride's family is, or perhaps with them. An example of this we could see in My Big Fat Greek Wedding. If any of you saw that movie, at the very end, the final joke is that she finally has her own house, but the house is just 2 houses away from her parents' house. Patrilocality is residence near or with the groom's family. And we could see an example of that in the Chinese family discussed in the reading for this week. And these kinds of locality can follow the kinship descent system of the community, but not always. So don't get them confused. They're not necessarily the same thing. And then we have neolocality, which is a marriage household in a new residence. And this is actually interesting to think about. So it's obviously quite common in the Western world, but it's really an adaptation to a particular set of economic circumstances. So it occurs more in places where it's better for people to move in order to get jobs. And so there are social and economic factors. If you have only the nuclear family living in a single residence, it's much easier to move. If you have an extended family living together and one person wants to move to get a job somewhere else, then it's much harder for that whole extended group to move together. Of course, when we look at families and family connections, we can see this social aspect in terms of flow of resources. There's power involved and so on. But we also have we also have emotional responses to the concepts, our ideas of family, our concepts of family, that are very universal. Not in terms of what that means, but in terms of how family is universal and we all have strong feelings about it. And it can produce very strong metaphors. So in American culture, there's an idea of creating solidarity through thinking about people as part of our family. And I think commonly in many different cultures we get this kind of metaphor. This idea that we're all brothers and sisters here. beyond other differences. And of course, it can be used negatively as well. We talked about the mafia example in the last presentation, the concept of nepotism too, where you have family connecting other family to particular resources that are maybe not owned to them or owed to them, but they are given perhaps a job or something like this in order to, just because they are family, in order to keep resources within the family. And these can undermine business and political structures of a society. So in our chapter for this week, Robbins ends by talking about different threats to different families, these family structures he described in the text. And it's important to just understand that while we talk about family using these terms and having these structures, there's a lot at stake, and also it's never completely set in stone. The family is maintained over and over and over again, and there are lots of ways that a family can not maintain the ideal, and that can be dealt with in different ways in different cultures. And then, kinship is always constructed or conceived of from certain points of view. It might be a core aspect of society, but when we look through different lenses, we might see different things at play. So, for example, feminist anthropologists in the 1970s pointed out that the information about kinship that anthropologists had been collected from men by male anthropologists. And so we're getting a narrow point of view related to kinship. So when we think of different aspects of gender, we can see that there's a lot at stake. And again, there's been a history in anthropology of having a much stronger male point of view. When ethnographers do research, not in every case, but in some situations, access to different genders can be very limited. So if you're a man going into a community doing research, you might have much more access to the other men in the community. You might be assumed to do the same things they do, spend time with them, etc., or spending time with women who aren't part of your family might be completely inappropriate, and vice versa. So women going into the community might have similar experiences. So that was something that feminist anthropologists in the 1970s noted and brought attention to. One example that's been really important is that for a long time, it was thought that women must play no role in decisions in families if men are in the position of power. And women pointed out that there's actually a lot of ways that women do exert influence, and that there are limitations on these kinship charts because they don't show other types of relationships. If you use a single dash for an unmarried relationship, maybe you put a slash through it if the relationship is no longer happening, but how do you show which relationships in what order, or which one had the most meaning to a community or to an individual? Can't really show people born out of wedlock. And again, doesn't show the levels of closeness, the actual relationship, the emotional or subjective aspects. For example, a child who is not close to a biological parent but is close to a step parent, how would that actually get shown on the kinship chart? There's no way of showing the level of involvement of the biological parent. So these anthropologists were able to really show that making a chart isn't enough. And Marjorie Wolf, in her ethnography, Women and Family in Rural Taiwan, which I show the image of her book there, did important work in this area. She noted that in rural Taiwan, a man's family is patrilineal, which had already been documented by anthropologists, but a woman's family is utilineal. She said there was a difference here in how each gender perceived their family structure. So for a woman's family, the person who gave birth to you and gave birth to her mother and who you gave birth to is the woman's source of support. In other words, women connected to other women through their uterus. So the woman being connected to her own child that she gave birth to, obviously, and then also being connected to the woman who gave birth to her and the person who gave birth to her mother. And once the woman has an offspring, Marjorie Wolf noticed that she really focuses on that relationship with them to ensure that she's accepted into the patrilineity of her husband. So in rural Taiwan, as described in our book, is very, well, Taiwan wasn't described in our book, but rural Taiwan is similar to the traditional Chinese family described in our book, in which in a marriage, a woman moves into her husband's home, and often there's extended family living there, including the husband's parents. And the new wife can be seen as a threat to the mother-in-law's uterine family. And in many kinship systems where the bride moves into her husband's family household, a main source of stress is between the bride and the mother-in-law. And many soap operas and dramas depict these kinds of tensions. Anyway, Marjorie Wolf said that the kinship chart doesn't work because it doesn't show which relationships a person focuses on. In Taiwan, a woman focuses on her uterine family, and especially her own child as part of that uterine family. Because if the child is seen as a member of her husband's family and brought into the fold in that way, then the mother has much more likelihood of becoming accepted as well into that family. So it's a form of protection for herself. People were really interested about women's agency and their level of power, because in the 70s in rural Taiwan, women didn't have many recourses to take if something wasn't going well in a marriage. So, for example, if she's being abused by someone in the household, her husband or maybe the mother-in-law. So, for a lot of time, people thought, well, these women are these passive victims in many ways, and we have to do things to help them, and so on and so forth, which, it may be true we should be doing things to help women in certain situations, but what Marjorie Wolf found was that women found ways of exploiting avenues to assert control and power in their lives. So this idea of women as passive victims was highly problematic and, frankly, insulting. And so she, for example, found that women could share how they were being treated with other families, which then affects the reputation and honor of the family that she's living with. Men must protect the honor of their family, so women could offer a counter-narrative regarding what was going on with their family in order to keep the husband in check. And Marjorie Wolf also found that the son's and mother's relationship in many ways overrides the son and father's relationship, which had thought to be the primary relationship. For example, people that she worked with said that while they would owe a funeral to their father, a son can't help but provide a funeral for his mother. So a funeral for his mother is done not out of a sense of obligation, but out of a sense of appreciation for her and for her work. So these were insights that could be gleaned when a woman went into the field and did work with other women and tried to understand things from their perspectives. So to talk about these interpretations, even in terms of a male point of view and a female point of view, is still probably a bit of a oversimplification. These are very broad generalizations still, and there are always other interpretations that are different from these ideas. And social change is always occurring all the time, so there's always new forms and interpretations available. However, it's just important to note that this was an important critique made regarding the way that kinship has been perceived of in the anthropological field. Oh, man, I forgot a slide. Okay, it's on your sheet, your note-taking sheet, that there's another critique that's really important here, which is that much of this approach to kinship is heteronormative. So it presents heterosexuality as the norm. And these terms tend to do that. Again, I want to just remind everybody that these patterns are not necessarily indicative of who is sleeping with who. So marriage and sex can overlap or have different expectations and norms depending on the culture and the community. Our last section of Chapter 5, there's a case study about HIV and AIDS prevention in Mexico, and we can see a lot of this complexity there. There's lots of cultural factors involving families that we might not think of. So in Mexico, what anthropologists found was that women in married relationships are expected to be monogamous, and men are not. Men often have multiple sexual partners, including other men. Men may sleep with other men, but not identify themselves as gay, depending on the situation and who is doing what to whom, and so on. There's very specific cultural ideas connected to these concepts regarding identity, gender identity, and sexual identity, and they vary around the globe, and we'll be talking about that more in future weeks. So I just bring this to your attention to keep in mind that there are layers of complexity beyond what's being discussed in the chapter. And we can see some of this complexity in the film for this week, Asante Market Women, which shows us more about one community of women and how they feel about polygamy in their experience. And we'll discuss more about these issues in our discussions as well.